This, as anyone who has gone through the Parson Capon House would recognize, is the sideboard, which is a traditional element that goes far back, even past the medieval period in Europe, and was copied here in North America. I want to show you this picture. This was a frontispiece in a cookbook published in 1683. And it tells us a little bit about the kitchen and the hearth. It's totally distorted because they were still working on the aspect of perspective. So, but let me point out a couple elements back here. They built the fire on the floor against the wall, and to capture the smoke and fumes, they built a large hood. Now this hood should be really over the fire. It's just they didn't learn perspective in doing this drawing. And they used these iron cranes in order to suspend the pot over the fire. This fellow here is standing, turning a spit in front of a screen to protect himself from the heat. So there were a lot of problems they were still trying to solve in the 17th century. I want to show you another frontispiece from a cookbook in the same period and point out a couple elements here. The room is divided in two. Of course, the men are eating, but it's all the women who are serving and doing the preparation. And the cat is cleaning up behind them. The chickens are being skewered onto long skewers that are being placed on a spit. And you see this weight is descending, and it's turning a crank that's going to turn this spit. Underneath that are pans for collecting the juices. Nothing was ever thrown away. Go ahead. Now we're going to jump to America. This was a typical American home, one room, with a hearth built in the very back, and upstairs the children would sleep, and produce and barrels would be kept. The table, of course, would have been nothing more than a couple trestles with large boards placed upon it. And during the day, in order to create some workspace, those boards were removed, leaned up against the wall, and the trestles were moved aside. There were, at this period here in the early late 17th century, early 18th century, there were generally only about one chair, if there were any at all, and the rest of the people, most of the people, the family sat on stools or benches. Now, it was the prerogative of the male to take possession of that one chair. And when those boards were laid upon the trestle, he became the chairman of the board. That's how that phrase came about. This is actually a Sturbridge village, and sometimes these hearths were actually built with two openings. The one opening would extend into the house, and the other opening would be bricked over. And the reason why is because every American had to hope that they would be able to expand their house and add more to it. And they didn't want to go through the additional trouble of building an additional hearth. They would simply break through the back end. There's a beautiful example of this up at Strawberry Bank. And the curators up there have actually covered the back of the house with plastic, so you can look at a hearth that's never been used. Go ahead. These houses were continuously added on to. This is the Rebecca Nurse house in Danvers. Of course, you know Rebecca Nurse was one of the so-called witches that was killed. Her house was continuously added on to. There are three magnificent hearths in this house. And I like this house because it's one of the few in America where they actually do hearthside cooking in a historic home, but using reproduction hearth equipment. I like this picture. This was in the Boston Globe about 5 years ago. It's a house in Dorchester that was torn down. 1/3 of it has already been removed, but I wanted you to see the massive brick structure that is found in these homes. 2 large hearths here on the first floor, over here to the side, a beehive oven, and of course openings on the 2nd and 3rd floor for heating the bedrooms. A beautiful example of massive brickwork would be the Spencer Pierce Little House up in Newburgh, which I would encourage you to visit. By the way, this house was torn down. It's been packaged up. It's in a barn. And anyone who wants to put down, I think they're offering $25,000 for it. I don't think the bricks come with it. The chimneys in these central fireplace homes have these massive, beautiful constructions. This is one you would see on Green Street in Ipswich. It's one of my favorite brickworks that extends above the roof line. This is probably one of the most famous of all hearths in America. It is the Hart House hearth from the Hart House in Ipswich, but it's not in Ipswich. It's on the 3rd floor of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I was actually there in July and had an opportunity to see it. This is actually from a postcard that's over 70 years old, because it was in the 1930s that the Metropolitan came in and bought that hearth, took it to New York City, and replaced it with an exact reproduction. But Henry Dupont was a little annoyed at that. So he came up to Ipswich and bought the other hearth, and he took it down to Winterthur in Wellington, Delaware. So if you want to see the 2 great hearths from the Hart House, you have to travel south. But they're excellent reproductions there at the Hart House in Ipswich, and you can have a martini too. A little bit about these hearths. This is the Rebecca Nurse house. We know it's a first period kitchen because there are no cranes. The pots would have been suspended from a wooden or metal lug pole built up in the chimney itself. That was the original style. And the beehive oven is built in the back. Another clue, not absolute, but that this is a first period fireplace. The reason why it was built in the back is because all the gas and fumes had to escape up the chimney. Because it does not have a flue. Masons were still working to perfect techniques on how to build flues in the beehive ovens. This is the Runlet May House in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. It's a magnificent hearth. There's another large one on the other side of this wall, but I wanted to show you a construction here that dates this hearth. This is a Rumford roaster, invented by a man who would call himself Count Rumford. Maybe some of you have heard of him. He was also known as, his real name was Benjamin Thompson. Americans generally know very little about this man because he was a Tory during the Revolutionary War, and he left Boston as a trader on evacuation day and went to Britain. But one of his inventions was this device, and I want to show you what it looks like today in the next slide. It is a retort. He invented the device that every bottle and can is sterilized in. This is for sterilizing food and canning food in the American food industry. It was simply scaled up to a larger device with conveyor belts. This is the Gardner Pendry House in Salem, it too has a Rumford roaster. There's not many of them in existence anymore. The White House had a Rumford roaster when it was built in 1800. And by the way, the White House cooked all of their meals on 3 hearths at the White House until 1850. I wrote this is one of my favorite hearths. This is in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. It's made of enormous granite stones with a beehive oven in the back that extends right through the wall, and it can be accessed from the back. It's really a commercial beehive oven because they can produce enormous quantities of food in that hearth. It's over 6 feet high. This is in New York. A lot of ashes are generated when you're doing big production cooking for a large family, and this becomes a potentially dangerous area for women moving around in large skirts and petticoats. I have read, though it's difficult to confirm, that next to childbirth, dying by fire from working at the hearth was the second leading cause of death for young women during the colonial period. While we were here in New England, cooking on the ground, on the floor, this back-breaking work, there were other parts of the country where they had already elevated the cooking stove and the beehive oven, and this was in Spanish California. But we didn't see this influence here in New England. This is one of the earliest drawings of a hearth. It's from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, from 1800 at the York Hotel. It's very distorted because the beehive oven is off to the side here when it would really be toward the back. We also see these, what are called trommels, pagan hook trommels, extending up into the chimney, meaning that this is an early first period hearth. And those trommels are hanging from a lug pole. This is Wethersfield, Connecticut. One of my favorite shots. It tells us a lot about a first period kitchen. There is that beehive oven mounted in the back. These wonderful ratchet trommels being suspended from a lug pole that we don't see. Another sign of a first period kitchen is all this woodenware called trainware. Chopping blocks, various devices here for molding food or fermenting bread. And also these 3-legged pots, and we'll talk more about that. This picture here is almost modern compared to that Wethersfield kitchen. We see these cranes being supported from the side walls. The beehive oven is moved to the side. It has its own flue, and the gases escape up it. And the hearth is also smaller. This is a scene from cooking at the Rebecca Nurse House in Danvers. This was back-breaking work, stooping, bending, getting close to fire. It was hot. Another scene from the same kitchen, stooping. This is at the Pioneer Village in Salem, which is now open to the public for the first time in a long time. It had been closed for about 10 years until Gordon College took over the management of it. This young lady is performing a very simple thing. She's taking a loaf of sugar that comes as hard as a rock from the Caribbean and unfolds this piece of blue paper that was wrapped around it. That paper was soaked in indigo, the second major crop in the Caribbean. And she took that piece of paper and she soaked it in water until she could extract all that indigo and then would add a chemical called alum, potassium aluminum sulfate, and would fix it as a permanent color. We would recognize that as the color of dungarees today. And it was the most popular color of clothing during the colonial period. And of course, cooking while you're pregnant, maybe an average of 7 children. An average home went through 17 cords of wood a year. Driving over here tonight, I passed a woodlot that said that a cord of wood, split, chopped, and seasoned, was going for $325 a cord. Yeah. That's why parsons like Parson Gapin generally got an allowance from the town of wood. That was part of his salary. It was dirty work. And they always had to keep a lot of water close at hand, not only for sanitary purposes, cleaning up utensils. This was dirty work. But with the introduction of iron stoves, women's work in the kitchen was made much better. We were the last industrial country in the world to adopt the iron stove. It was not until 1840 that more people had iron stoves than did not. It's hard to believe. Europe was way ahead of us. Now, one of the main reasons for the lack of the iron stove in the colonies, well, there's a lot of reasons, one of which was the British putting imports on the importation of metals and iron and so forth. But the biggest influence on keeping the stove out of the home were the mainline churches that preached against them. They said if women had access to iron stoves, they would have more time on their hands. And they would become subject to perdition and sink into sin. And men, do not let the devil come into your kitchen. Now that sounds silly, doesn't it? But there are hundreds of sermons written during the early 19th century that preach this kind of attitude. But women said, get it. We want it. The first cookbook published in North America was The Complete Housewife by E. Smith. Well, we don't know if E. Smith ever existed. It was probably a woman's personal collection of recipes from an English woman that a publisher got a hold of and simply put a fictitious name to. But it was so popular, it was republished. This was a British cookbook. It was republished in Williamsburg, Virginia in 1742 and was a tremendously popular book. As a matter of fact, that every ship coming into Boston and Baltimore and Philadelphia and New York carried a trunk of cookbooks. Women couldn't wait to get the latest thing from Hannah Glass and Susanna Carter and E. Smith, whoever that was. But the first true American cookbook was Amelia Simmons' cookbook, published in Hartford, Connecticut in 1796. And this is a book that declared culinary independence from Britain. I mean, she took that honorable plum pudding in E. Smith's book and renamed it Independence Cake. I mean, you talk about, French fries being renamed Freedom Fries during the Gulf War. Been there, done that. First American cookbook was making political statements about food. She's the first person ever to recommend turkey be served with cranberry sauce. The first woman ever to use the word cookie and coleslaw in a cookbook. And she was the first person ever to use a chemical leavening agent, which we would recognize today as baking powder. This was another popular one, The Frugal Housewife by Susanna Carter. The greatest cookbook author of the 19th century was Lydia Maria Child, and she published her cookbook here in America and called it The Frugal Housewife and was immediately sued by Susanna Carter. And so Lydia Mariah Child, she's from Sudbury, went back to the publisher and said, call it the American Frugal Housewife. So that's how she won her lawsuit. But our homes here in New England were just filled with British cookbooks. Right before the Civil War, a very interesting phenomenon developed, the charity cookbooks, where women got together, put a committee and worked on committees and published cookbooks to raise money for a new organ at the church or for other reasons. But another important book of the 19th century was the Boston Cooking School cookbook by Fanny Farmer. Go ahead. This was a period during the 19th century where new products were being developed. Advertising was taking sway in America, and it was necessary to teach Americans how to eat chocolate. So little cookbooklets were developed. And these are highly collectible items today. And this one was farmer extracted beef. Little cookbooks were published. I bet a lot of you in this room have them at home and consider them cherished items, and they are. Also, in poetry from the 19th century, the image of the hearth, the kitchen, was very powerful. I won't read these at length. John Greenleaf Whittier. I love Snowbound. It's the kind of thing that you want to read when it is snowing here in New England. We watched the first red blaze appear, heard the sharp crackle, caught the gleam of whitewashed wall and sagging beam, until the old, furnished room burst flower-like into rosy bloom. And he goes on and on and on, just meditating, sitting in front of a hearth. And Henry Wadsworth Longfellow did the same thing. This is actually out of the first edition of his book called The Hanging of the Crane. It was a tradition when a new couple moved into a new house that all the neighbors and relatives would come and hang the crane in their hearth, and they would celebrate that evening. They came with merriment just to celebrate the hanging of the crane in a new house. Into the night are gone, but still the fire upon the hearth burns on, and I alone remain. It's a sad poem. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow lost his wife to fire. She was putting wax on her face. You've heard that expression, watch your beeswax? Yeah. Women used to put it on their face if they had pock marks. It's hard to believe. Smallpox left a lot of women scarred. They put it on their face, and she got too close to some fire and caught fire and died within a day of that. Go ahead. Oh, yes, this is Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's kitchen. I'm in Portland, Maine. This is what curators should never do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Dutch ovens, or tin reflective ovens, they're called. You don't want to bring out everything you own and put it out there. Bring it out in a seasonal way or something, but you don't have to have it hanging around all at once. There's the beehive oven off to the side. This device here is a device that you would put over the coals at night. Depending on how many coals you had, it came in various different sizes. This device was called a curfew. But, I see you smiling. There was another one that was only half the size and it had a handle. And you would scrape the coals against the wall, and that was called a nightcap. And I find it interesting that these two devices come down with nocturnal meanings. These are your wonderful pots here at the Parson Catering House. The 3 legs, which is the traditional, most efficient way for Cooking, by the way, you don't suspend pots over fire, but over a roaring fire. You suspend them over burning coals. And every woman knew which wood produced the best coals for the best pot and the best results. They knew that their fruit woods, their ashes, their maples, their mahogany, well, not mahogany, but maples, which one to scrape under the pot. I go into some historic homes and I see these 8-foot logs, weighing 200 pounds in the hearth. And I'm saying, what is it doing there? Who was thinking when they placed all that lumber in the hearth? This is a 3,000-year-old cooking pot from Iraq, Mesopotamia. 3 legs. Here's another one from Korea. It's also 3,000 years old. 3 legs. These pots here, they're generally called spiders because seen at night in a dark kitchen, that's exactly what they look like. They all came with different size legs for different size food items to be cooked in there. Sometimes they sat on a trivet, so this one did not have legs, this one had legs. But what is nice is there are companies producing all of this equipment as facsimiles and reproductions. So any historic home or anyone who owns a hearth can purchase this material and do authentic hearthside cooking. But some people need instructions simply to use a pot. Go ahead. Now, I showed you that earlier photograph from a book that had a spit on it. Some spits were turned by putting an animal, like a gerbil in a cage that turns a spit. Not only were dogs used, but in the southern part of America, they actually used slave boys who would walk on a treadmill that turned the spit. We get clockwork mechanisms to turn spits in the kitchen. At the same time, we get clocks because they were both made by the same artisans in the community. This device here is called a smoke jack. It's actually a mechanism with a fan attached to it, and as the smoke goes up the chimney, it turns the fan and then turns the belt that turns the spit. It's a smoke jack. Around 1725, we get an influx of Irish immigrants who know how to work with very thinly rolled metal coming in from the Netherlands and Germany. This is Sturbridge Village. Go ahead. And they start inventing a lot of devices to make life easier in the kitchen for women. Here's a tin Dutch oven, also known as a tin reflective oven. You say, but Joe, a Dutch oven is really a cast iron pot with a closely fitting lid. Well, a lot of things were called Dutch then, because the word Dutch was attached to anything that was clever and smart. And so it gets a little confusing reading recipes from this period where you're told to put it in a Dutch oven and you're looking for a pot when you're really supposed to be putting it on a spit. So you have to read critically from these cookbooks. This is another example of that Dutch oven where it hangs on a hook. There would be a basting pan here, and that side would open up to the fire. This is another device, but it's got a clockwork, a spring mechanism attached to the top of it for turning the ham. This woman here is opening it up to baste it. Good. Not only are we going to see a lot of items made from tin, we're going to see every conceivable device being invented. Whips and beaters and egg beaters here. Things were rolling out doughs, and making cookies and flour sifters. I want to look at the beehive oven again and look at all those wonderful ashes here. All the ashes were saved, of course. They were used in making soap. They would also use it to extract potash, or what was also called saleratus, which became a potassium carbonate when it was properly handled by the housekeeper. And that would be used as a leavening agent in baked goods. Nothing was thrown away. And then eventually it would be used as a fertilizer in the garden. I actually took this picture 40 years ago when I visited Plymouth Plantation. And they're still doing it. A beehive oven at waist height for baking bread. Every village and community had one if you did not have one in your own kitchen. It required an awful lot of wood to burn in these beehive ovens. And this is the beehive oven here at the Parson Capen House. Just a magnificent hearth here. We see this chain trowel extending up into the chimney, and there would be a lug pole up there from which it was supported. These wonderful andirons, the three-legged pots, the beehive oven with its door. After burning maybe a lot of wood, maybe it would take about 3 hours to heat up a beehive oven. And then the woman would go into it, and she had various techniques. She would take a handful of oak leaves and throw it into the oven and watch how they burned. Or some women would throw in a cabbage leaf. And everybody had their own secret on telling the temperature of a beehive oven. If it was at its maximum heat, it was called a quick oven. And items would be put in. The door would seal it closed. Generally, the first doors were wood, as it appears in this case. And then mud would seal it. And at the end of the baking period, the seal was broken, the food was taken out, and other food was put in, and that became a slack oven. I have seen these ovens used as long as 3 days later because these ovens would act as a heat sink. And after 3 days, you can still dry apple slices and so forth. They were constantly kept in the production. I watched this being done. We were making some apple pies here. This was up in New York. As a matter of fact, this is Eastfield Village in New York, and they specialize in training curators how to do various things. And every year they hold, not every year, but every couple of years, they hold a beehive oven building school. And there's a whole field with the leftovers of the student projects from that summer. And that's what I photographed here. But it shows you what the back of a beehive oven looked like built into a home. Required an enormous quantity of wood. And this wood had to be dried and cured. And if you're using 7 cords of wood a year, you have it constantly arriving at your house or facility. It's being cut and split. It's being put under some kind of lean-tos. Or some people would even build an extra room onto their house to hold all of this wood. And it had to be sorted by species. You had to keep your fruit wood separate from your oak and your maples. Talk a little bit about drinking. Golden Ball Tavern is one of my favorite. Go ahead. This is a cage bar. Before there were what we would recognize as a bar today, a long counter, longer than it is wide, over which you order a drink and the bartender presides. It was generally an innkeeper a tavern keeper who lived on the premises, came into this caged room from his private residence. He would open up these slats that could swing out or swing up into the ceiling, and then by doing that, he was announcing he's open for business. Come up to me, and I will prepare generally a punch, as he's doing here. He wanted to protect his valuable properties, particularly his spirits like gin and brandy that were very expensive. Rum wasn't that expensive. And his crockery that was imported from China. These were very valuable, and he wanted to keep them locked up. This is a wonderful painting. Later on, when drinking gets even worse in the 19th century, this is a Prohibition painting. This is a politician holding court in a tavern. There's the devil coming in the back door. There's a kid here, about 13 years of age, maybe trying to empty the glasses that were put on the bar. It's called Devil Liquor. This is actually in the possession of Historic New England and hangs in the pantry at Cogswell Grant in Essex. This is what a typical tavern looked like. There were spoons, no forks, of course. Potteryware, woodenware, treeware on the table, ubiquitous knife and spoon. And this is actually out in California. This was a military camp during the 19th century for American troops. This is the first room you see when you go to Winterthur in Wilmington, Delaware. No one would have ever set a table like this. Winterthur wants you to see this table first, and all this beautiful crockery. So they're setting it on the mahogany. You would never do that in the home. You would put down a tablecloth. And on the floor, you would put a table rug, which was normally a piece of canvas that would be painted in some attractive pattern. And that was to capture all the grease and dirt that fell on the floor. This is another example. General Vallejo's house out in Sonoma. Yes. And he had it shipped intact from New England. I think from Lynn it left. He wanted an authentic American New England house out there in Sonoma. This was a boarding house in Sonoma. Now, this is the second room you see at Winterthur, where this is how it was actually set for a small family. Notice faux food. I mean, any museum worth its salt is going to have faux food today. And many send away to Japan to have it made. I was at Beauport in Gloucester on Saturday, and it was my second visit in 2 years. And they had just opened up the 1930s kitchen in the back. And they ordered all this beautiful faux food, these cantaloupe melon balls, and they even took lemonade and got a pitcher and filled it with all this faux lemons. It looks like you can drink it immediately. They had a standing pork, they had a pork roast surrounded with vegetables, just beautiful. It gives more authenticity when you're visiting a historic home. Curators are finally learning, or have learned and taught us, the two most important rooms in a historic house, the kitchen and the dining room. Watch people fantasize when they go into those two rooms. They're the two that they can really identify with. Go ahead. Of course, women would entertain. Their female friends in the afternoon or after dinner with sweet cake, cheese, and maybe a little bit of sherry or pork. And the men would be staying back in the dining room. And they would then pull the tablecloth off. They would bring out the bottles of Madeira or make a punch, or hard liquors would be brought out. Cigars would be made available, and they would do some serious drinking. Teas were very popular in the afternoon. Mr. Boardman, who lived at the Spencer Pierce Little House in 1780 to 1800, he held these famous teas almost every afternoon for as many as 40 people. I mentioned that, and I'm going to come back to the problem with 40 people coming to your house and drinking tea for 3 hours. This was the typical utensils on the table, a 2-time fork, a knife, and spoons. We were the last Western country to have the fork introduced to us. It started out in Italy, went to France, jumped over to Britain, and finally came here. And as a result, we eat different than they do in Britain. And I'll try and explain why. I was at Sturbridge Village on July 4th. This was a meal laid out for the enactors and docents. A beautiful meal. A pudding here, a custard, bread, jams and jellies, pickles, roast chicken, a plum pudding of some sort. And I watched. In his left hand, he has the fork, and in his right hand, a knife, and he's proceeding to learn how to eat with this new device. And I went around photographing these people. I'm glad they didn't tell me to stop, because I was really intruding on their privacy here. And she's got her knife filled with food, putting it into her mouth. Now, the Britons, they figured it out. You stab the food with your 2-time fork or 3-time, you hold it down, you hold the knife in your right hand, you cut it, and then you impale it and bring it to your mouth. And that's how Europeans do it today. We couldn't figure it out. We impaled it, we knew that part, we took our knife, we cut it, we put our knife down, transferred the fork to our right hand, and then used it as a spoon to bring food to our mouths. This was sort of intermediary. Now, I was in Thailand 2 years ago. Matter of fact, I lived in Thailand during the 60s, during the war. And then you only ate with chopsticks in Bangkok. And when I went back 2 years ago, there were no chopsticks. I was only served chopsticks once, and that was in a Korean restaurant. Thais have abandoned the chopstick. They use a fork and a spoon. They hold down their food with the fork, and they cut it with the spoon, or they transfer it to their mouth with the spoon. Sometimes they take the fork and they impale something. I saw a guy cut a sandwich in 4, impale it, and bring it up a quarter of a sandwich and eat around it. They're still working it out in Bangkok. Sideboards were a new innovation in America toward the end of the 18th century. Food would come out, sit on the sideboard, and then it would be dispersed to the recipients. Anyone who could afford a sideboard had a sideboard. Go ahead. Now, sideboards were also important because they had drawers on the side. And inside those drawers, they kept their bottles of alcohol and also a chamber pot. Now, the women would leave to have their sweet cakes and sherry. The men are left alone smoking, telling dirty jokes, and drinking. And this was a big improvement over a vase put behind the curtains. Now you still have one in the Parson Capon house here. Punch. Every home that could afford it served punch. This was a male prerogative. When the men arrived, he would gather them together. And then he would go through this ritual of preparing punch. 5 ingredients. He would add something, what was called light. It could be tea or water, or even a rye wine. He would add something strong. That could be rum or brandy or a combination of both. A sweet, generally sugar, a citrus product of some kind, and then a scrape of nutmeg on top. That was a traditional punch made thousands of different ways with many different ingredients, but it was a male prerogative. Many of these ceramic bowls came in with commemorative information embossed on them. And here is one at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I took this picture in July. It was the woman's prerogative to serve soup. She would stand as the master over this. And the soup of choice during the colonial period was turtle soup. It's hard to imagine today the number of turtles flowing into Boston and Philadelphia. They were coming in from the Caribbean. Some places like Baltimore, Boston, and Philadelphia actually there were stores or shops that were called turtle dressers. And all they did was butcher turtles, because it required considerable skill, because turtles had a gall sac, and if it was ruptured, it could spoil the whole thing. So it really required some expertise. Turtle soup was served everywhere, particularly in taverns. But when turtles started to dry up and they were not as abundant, we had to re-envision this soup, and it was reinvented as mock turtle soup. Yes, in Alice in Wonderland, what do you have? That wonderful character of a turtle with a calf's head. Because they would make this from calf's head. They would take a calf's head and cook it down with the liver, the heart, the lungs, and the esophagus, and then scrape all the meat off it, add some Madeira, and after about 5 hours of cooking, you have mock turtle soup. Soup in Turin was served in every home throughout the 19th century, right up through the Victorian era, and every restaurant would always precede the opening of a meal with a Turin soup being brought out. Eventually, these fireplaces, these hearths, were retrofitted. This one was retrofitted as a coal fire. Go ahead. Some were actually bricked over, and an iron stove was attached. They probably kept the beehive oven off to the side for holiday cooking. By this time, they were probably already getting bread delivered to the home or going to a bakery in town. But notice how low this oven is. You know, even though women got their emancipation and got the iron stove, they were still made to bend and stoop. It would take another 40 years until the iron stove was convenient enough for women not to stoop in bed. Look at the construction of this. Required stooping and bending. Here's an image that was in, I think, Harper's Magazine. Guys reading the newspaper, the low level of the stove here, the woman's cooking, he's stretching and yawning, and somebody's bringing guests home. Just what she needed. Gradually, it's working its way up, but it's not there yet. Oh, she has arrived. It's at waist height. This is the model kitchen here. It's with a soapstone sink here, gas coming in for illumination and also to cook with, a window to look out of, and rugs on the floor. I mean, this was to die for. A big stove. There's that pantry in the back. Again, the introduction of the window over the sink. These become standard elements that all architects will work into homes for the next century. We had a problem with domestics in this country toward the end of the 19th century, so cooking schools proliferated. Probably the most famous is the Boston Cooking School in Boston. I'm just going to coming to sort of a closure now. I just want to mention some of the innovations that were going to take place. Advertising. And this came about when a young man who worked for a company in Boston called Sands, Taylor and Wood was bringing in flour from upstate New York. And Sands went over to see a play at Harvard about knights and Camelot and so forth. And he came back and he says, look, I got this great idea. Let's put a knight on a horse and we'll put it on all of our products. People will never forget us. And that was around 1798, and it's still there. Ice. Frederick Tudor in Boston got the idea of mechanically harvesting ice, first on Fresh Pond in Cambridge, and then he came up with what is now Route 1A and started harvesting ice off Wenham Lake, putting it in wooden houses, and then that's why they built the railroad from Boston to Newburyport, was to help Frederick Tudor get his ice to Lynn so he could ship it to Barbados. And also to Bombay and Calcutta. You say, that's impossible. The stuff's going to melt on its way to Calcutta. Yeah, 40% of it did. But he had 60% of it to sell in Bombay. And he made a fortune doing that. And of course, Gustavus Swift from Sandwich, Mass., he said, wow, they got ice up there in Lake Michigan. And I can get those cows into corrals there. And we can butcher them there, pack them in ice from Lake Michigan, and bring that beef in refrigerated rail cars right into Boston. And that's exactly what he did. And then that started the development of ice boxes, really ice boxes, where you mounted it on your kitchen wall, and the guy who delivered ice didn't even have to come into your house and track that water all over the place. You open up this little door in the back of your house, slip the 25 pounds of ice in, and close the door. Any of you have a house that has that little door in the back of it? One guy's smiling back there.
Had a house in the hut.
Exactly. I told this to a group of people one day. This woman said, oh my God, is that what that thing was for? By 1950, we have Levittown. Notice how that house looks like that one-room house in Sturbridge. But look at this wonderful paint, don't you love it? Then in the 1950s, men want to start cooking. So they pick up a copy of Popular Mechanics and they go out there with cinder block and red brick and field stones and they build these monoliths. I got 3 of them on the street I live on that are enormous. I've never seen them used. I've lived there for 35 years. They put plants on them. Okay. This is Julia Child's kitchen. And when she moved from Cambridge in her 80s and went back to Santa Barbara, this was dismantled, and you can see it today. It's in the Smithsonian. And you can see her original kitchen. There's the other half of it. It was just simple and modest. She put a pegboard up on the wall and just hung her pots. Oh, isn't that to die for? I want one of those. Yeah. Forget those field bricks. You know, this is where cooking has moved to. And look at this. Isn't this reminiscent of that 1683 picture we saw of that enormous hood extending out over this designer kitchen? I mean, back then it was functional. Is that functional? Someone told me they were shooting a TV program for the History Channel, and someone volunteered to let the cameras come in to see their designer kitchen they were so proud of. And when the technicians went in there, they found the original labels and instruction booklets still in the oven. They paid $80,000 for their kitchen and never used it. They wanted it on TV. Thank you very much. Oh, yes. If anyone has some questions, I'm sure we have some a little time.
Well, this isn't exactly a question, but you mentioned Count Rumford. He was born in Woburn.
Yes, he was.
And his house is a museum. It is really an interesting place. It has a live-in docent, by the way.
Count Rumford is one of the most unappreciated one-time Americans, because he did leave this country, though he did want to come back desperately. And he tried every which way. He wrote to John Adams when he was president, and he says, you know, I know a lot about the military. I think you could benefit by having a trained military force, and I recommend you go about it this way. And he really wanted to be the commandant of this new school. John Adams said, no, thank you, and proceeded to establish West Point. But it was Count Rumford's idea. Count Rumford is the guy who invented the drip coffee pot, thermopane windows, central heating, on and on. He's one of the most brilliant men who possibly ever lived. But he just was screwed up politically. Go ahead.
Why was that oven called a beehive?
Beehive, because when bees were raised on farms, they would construct a hive out of straw that looked like it was conical in shape, and it had holes in it for the bees to go in and build their comb. But it was out of straw, and it was that shape. The shape of which is one of the more efficient ways for cooking food and maintaining heat, had the same shape of a beehive.
What was the influence of German and Dutch populations on cooking in colonial America? You know, those who lived in New York and Pennsylvania, your state.
Yes, there were several large populations, particularly along the Hudson Valley area into New York and Philadelphia and Lancaster County and so forth. They made a lot of contributions to food, and we believe that the first American cookbook by Amelia Simmons is a reflection of that. We don't know much about this woman at all, but from her recipes we can tell that she worked for a Dutch family. And because she was the first one that used the word cookie, which was a corruption of a Dutch word for oil cake. She used the word coleslaw for the first time, for sliced cabbage. And there are other indications in there of strong Dutch influence. And we also see it in their paintings and the vanitasises. A vanitas was a painting that had food in it that was corrupting, or was turned over, or spilled, or half eaten. And the Dutch like to hang these in their dining rooms and kitchens as a reminder that life was short. Oh, that's all right.
What year was the two-pronged fork introduced, and then when was the three-pronged fork?
That's difficult to say. The two-pronged fork probably started off in the 14th century in Italy by the elite, the upper class, and gradually stayed that way. It was modeled after a pitchfork, literally, and moved into France, and it still retained that two-time. There is some anecdotal evidence that the Parker House was the first commercial establishment in America to use a three-time fork. But early in the 19th century, we begin to see that. But I don't have exact dates.
Is there any reason that a serving fork has 2 tines rather than 3?
I think it's more functional, that you can pierce a piece of meat easier and quickly, and they're also longer. It's more functionality in doing that. While a 3-tine, you get a little bit more resistance. You're not going as deep. That's how I understand it.
What was the most popular main course for dinner?
What was the most popular main course dinner? Whatever was in season was the most popular. Up in this area, when salmon were still swimming in the Merrimack River, whenever salmon were swimming, you had salmon on the table. And any kind of fish. We didn't have the ability to go to supermarkets and the way we did in the past. You had a lot of salt meat that was served. You would preserve your pig by slaughtering it, pickling most of it, making baked bacon. And when you looked up the chimney and you saw those lug poles, not only were trommels hanging from it, but you would find hams and bacon and sausages of all kinds, smoked meats galore. I mean, that whole chimney was filled with food being cured, and whatever was in season.
One more question.
Yes?
This might sound like a foolish question, but I wanted to confirm my understanding. In a beehive oven, you actually put the wood and the food in the same place in the oven.
No. You fill it with wood, you burn all that wood, and then you scrape out all the ashes after about 3 hours, and you clean it out. You got tools for doing that. And then you put your food into a clean oven, seal the door, and let it go.
I see. Thank you.
Yes. You had to burn all that wood down to ash. You got a hot sink here, a heat sink, and you want those walls to glow red. Thank you very much again, and I see some food here.
This program has been a production of Topsfield Cable Television.